For more, I want to bring in Wendy Murphy. She's a former prosecutor and teaches sexual violence law at New England Law. She joins me now from Boston. Wendy, what do we know about this new investigation?
Well, the good news is there's another investigation, and it's the feds. There's nothing better than when the federal government gets involved in a case like this for a lot of reasons. One, they have enormous resources. Two, they have really tough crimes. The laws in New York, for example, around sexual assault, which are supposedly still under investigation by Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance, are just weak and difficult to prove. And even if you prove them, the punishments are meager compared to federal sex crimes, where they are easier to prove and the punishments go up to life behind bars. So this is very good news for the victims who have yet to see any kind of justice in the form of an actual criminal charge.
How exactly is this different from the investigations already open in LA and Manhattan?
Well, the difference is that this is a federal investigation looking at whether a federal crime was committed. The California and New York investigations are examining whether Weinstein's conduct constituted a sexual assault under state law. And again, the state law charges are tough to win, tough to prove, because they require proof of force in addition to non-consent. And we know that Weinstein was able to commit his offenses without use of force because he used his authority, his size, his threats to ruin women's careers. That's not usually enough under state law, but guess what? Under federal law, if the feds can show that he lured some of the victims across state lines and then committed an offense in New York, for example, that gives the feds jurisdiction, and the way they prove an offense could be a lot easier because they don't have to prove force. It's enough under federal law to prove that the offenses he committed were done simply without the women's consent. That's really good news because we know from all the stories from Weinstein's victims that he rarely had to use force. Sometimes he did, but in the vast majority of cases, the women said he didn't use force. He used his influence. And under federal law, that may well be enough to put him behind bars.
You talk about sort of that use of force and that he didn't need to necessarily use as much force. How about intent? How are prosecutors going to prove his intent? And do you think that the bar is just set too high?
I'm not sure the bar is too high with a guy like Weinstein, where you can prove his intent by bringing in lots of the victims who will show a pattern of his conduct. And the issue of intent, I think, is important with regard to whether he was luring the women for a sexual, nefarious, and criminal purpose. Obviously, if he lied to the women about why he wanted them to come to New York, for example, and there was no job there, and it wasn't an interview, and he wasn't in an office, he was in a bathrobe or naked in a bathtub, that proves his intent pretty clearly, that his intent was not what he said it was. It was not to offer them a job. It was to engage in sexual activity, potentially criminal sexual activity, and that's all the feds need, essentially to show that he lied when he lured the women to come to him, and he intended at all times to commit a sex offense, not to offer them a job or interview them for a job. So there's a lot of evidence here about Weinstein's intent, something you don't typically see in terms of mountains of evidence. You don't typically see it in a criminal case, but this guy's record is so long and so bad that it would be really hard for the defense in a case like this to say, oh no, he really did intend to give them a job in Hollywood. I don't think so.
Wendy, what would you say the next steps are? What can we expect to see from Weinstein and his legal team, as well as the prosecutors?
Well, it's been reported that Weinstein and his attorneys tried to persuade the feds not to open an investigation, and they obviously failed. So that's good news. You have to believe that the feds have some evidence that he not only lured the women, but did it with the sort of intent that makes it worth their while. So now the question is, how long will they take to make their decision? And I hope it's not a long time, because these women have been waiting many, many months, in many cases waiting years for some sort of justice to happen. And The feds, again, because they have so many more resources than state officials, can act more quickly. Plus, they've got the advantage of a lot of journalistic investigations that they can look to and rely on to determine whether they can prove their charges. They don't have to back to square one or write on a blank slate. They have a lot of evidence that they already have had access to. So this is not the beginning of an investigation for the feds. This is likely more toward the end, because of the amount of information that's already out there. In that sense, I think we could have a decision about whether the feds will move forward with charges very, very quickly. And I think it's embarrassing that the state officials, who are supposed to take priority when it comes to sex crimes cases, they're mostly supposed to be prosecuted in state court. And we have prosecutors in California and New York with an awful lot of evidence doing absolutely nothing. They should just make the decision and let it go and move on and let the federal government take over and prioritize this case. In a way, it's a little bit like the Bill Cosby case. So many women, so many states, so many jurisdictions, so many potential charges, but it was Pennsylvania that took the lead. We may see something like that here. Lots of potential cases, but ultimately the federal government took the lead and saw that justice was done. That's what I hope, and I do expect them to make a decision very quickly.
Okay, Wendy Murphy, thank you for joining us.